you are more and more visible. So what does it mean if you are more and more visible? The media will look into your company. Who are you really? Why are you so big? How is your working environment? How is your human resources management? How do you take care of the environment? So this is what people in Europe ask. And this is what customers and the media and governments in Europe ask. You know, at the end of the day, they don't ask about your quality. Of course, your quality needs to be good anyway. Because if it's not good, you lose out anyway. So the question is not keeping on focusing on the quality alone because you want to be the best one when it comes to quality. No. The further you get on the surface and the further you develop and the further you get into the European market, the more transparency will need to come into your company. And many Chinese companies, again, they grew up in another environment. For them, it's very, very difficult to live up to the challenge. And I remember that company, I have very good contacts with them and I often talk to them and then they say, well, you know, I don't understand. We have such a good quality, we have such a good product. Why is it that, you know, newspaper, there's always newspaper articles and they complain about our, you know, not really communicating with our Swiss employees? That's not true. I say it is, because this is what people say, because this is what employees say. They are not happy. So they tell the media and, you know, media wants to report and they want to find out, and wait a minute, what's the problem with those guys? What's the problem with the company? And even though you are very, very good, nobody doubts that. As soon as someone of your employees is not happy, he will talk to the media. And if he talks to the media, you know, at the same time, this means that you are very transparent. You know, suddenly people will look at you. Suddenly people want to know more about you. They want to read more in the newspaper about you. They want you to, you know, talk about your social responsibility. They want you to talk about your environmental understanding. How do you support social development? What does your company do in order to benefit the well-being of people there? So these are things suddenly popping up. And these are the things which Chinese companies more and more face up to. That was not the same in the past. So again, the shifting of the industry, and especially for private entrepreneurs, the necessity of getting into other areas, other segments of the industry, suddenly changes the environment you are into in Europe. And questions then being asked, or the perception of the environment of that Chinese company changes. And this then are challenges way beyond the traditional strategic challenges those companies have faced up to in the past. Now, again, still looking at investment enterprises, we have an investment of China in Europe. We have looked at the regional distribution, looking at that from a standpoint of total direct investment from China, as well as the number of projects. We have looked at the sectors of Chinese enterprises. So we know there is a difference between the sector that investment is done, equipment, telecom, chemical industry, whatever, and at the same time we have looked at the number of transactions which actually have been implemented. Now in the next step, we have to look at the ownership structure. So looking at the ownership structure, we have talked about that before briefly. who is investing? Who is those Chinese companies we always talk about? So what do you mean when we say, well, you know, Chinese enterprise investment or Chinese overseas investment in Europe? How is the ownership structure? Here, we just differ between state-owned enterprises and private enterprises. Just to make it easier, we use those two comparisons. And then again, we just follow the same line. On the one side, we look at the volume of money being invested and the number of transactions being realized through those transactions. So here we see, for example, the distribution of China's investment in the European Union according to the ownership structure. It's the figures, again, 2000 to 2011 of cumulative investments. Again, here it's very easy and very interesting and a very simple picture. If you just look at the total transaction volume, so if you look at the money in million US dollars that has been used by Chinese enterprises to invest in the European market, we see very clearly that state-owned enterprises have invested a lot. State enterprises have invested about 3 times the amount of what private enterprises have invested. Why? Well, we know, we have seen it before. State-owned enterprises, in most cases, they follow the logic and they have, of course, a responsibility, because they are state-owned enterprises, that they make sure that China does have sufficient resources in order to take care and guarantee its own development. So this would require very heavy investment in resources, for example. It would require investment in sectors which are very investment intensive, and they do have the money necessary to do that investment because they have a different backing by the government, and they do have, of course, a different channel into financing structures. So if they need money, they get money, more or less. Of course, it's not that simple, but basically, this is the logic. State-owned enterprise engage in very capital-intensive investment to make sure that there's enough resources for China's development, just simply spoken. Whereas if you look at private enterprises, so private enterprises is about 1/3 of the volume invested in Europe. But if we look at the amount of projects they invest in, then we see that private enterprises, using about 1/3 of the amount invested by state-owned enterprises, have way more projects they invest in than state-owned enterprises. So looking at this from this point, when we look again at the transaction number, the logic is, even though state-owned enterprises invest in bigger projects because they need to make sure to have the resources available for China's development and, of course, to take care of other interests, they do have sufficient and enough resources to do that because they have a different background, a different ownership structure. Whereas private enterprises, they don't have so much funds available. Like state-owned enterprises, there's no way. They don't have the same access to financial means, like the banking industry. They have to find out other ways. So in most cases, they have to take care of their own financing by their own means. But they focus on a much broader space and a much broader diversity of projects they invest into.